So I wanted to bring up some big topics. Nature versus nurture. I'm still sitting at the computer because I'm going to start a poll here in a second. I'm going to go ahead and send out that poll. Launch polling. I want to know, which one do you think carries more weight? Nature or nurture? In many ways, this is me asking you the question, is it genetics or is it environment that impacts your behavior? Okay. We're not even showing 90% voting yet. Okay, there we are. Now we're at 90% voting. We still have 15 more students to vote. Well, I'll give you the punchline right now. 19% say nature, 81% are saying nurture, that it has to do with the environment more than genetics. And that was kind of a trick question. Honesty is the best policy, because in our science today, we say it's both. It used to be the case when I started in the field of psychology as an undergraduate, it used to be the case that you were either in nature or nurture, but you could never be in both. And today, as developmental psychologists especially, we know that it's a combination of the two. Because if we were to try to attribute your behavior and explain what you're doing and how you're thinking and how you're feeling, if we only try to explain that using your genetics, we're not going to tell the whole story. But conversely, if we only try to use your environment, your context, and everything else like that, and we ignore your genetics, we're still not going to tell the whole story. So when we talk about nature versus nurture, we can talk about genetic predispositions, right? Predispositions for certain personality traits, certain resiliencies, certain processes, okay? We're talking about having a predisposition when we talk about nature. Nurture, right, is what happens when we take that quality and we put it into this environment. And I think that that's wicked romantic, because let's say I have the DNA to be a concert pianist, but nobody ever puts a piano in my hand. What good does that DNA do? Okay. Now, can we force somebody to become a concert pianist who might not have the genetic predisposition for it? Maybe, right? With some practice and some due diligence, we might be able to do that. But what we look for and what we strive for, especially in our American culture, is this synchronicity, this magical ebb and flow for us between our deep internal competencies and our environment, right? Finding that sweet spot. In the science of flourishing and positive psychology, we talk about the phenomenon of flow, about what it means to be so into something, so on top of it, so excited about something, that you're literally in a state where you're disconnected from reality, you're totally honed in on it. And I'm not talking about the distraction of binge watching Netflix or gaming excessively. Now, there are some theorists that say that you can be in a state of flow in gaming, and I would advocate that that could be true. But I would also want to say that that state of mind also needs to be coupled with an awareness of how that degree of investment contributes or detracts from relationships. Because if you're gaming and if you're doing things like that because the rest of the real world is just too much for you, there's some amount of that that's coping and is completely appropriate. We call it distraction coping. But for the most part, what we see is it working to a negative degree. That real life is just too much, that the fantasy life is so much more comfortable. So nature versus nurture, is it genetics or is it the environment? And I'm here to tell you folks that when we talk in our science today, we talk about it being both, okay? Our genetic predisposition for social emotional development is our temperament, okay? That's our biology. Now, depending upon what kind of family we get into, how responsive our caregivers are, that is where the attachment comes from. You can have a really what we call difficult to soothe individual, like an infant, brand spanking new, that doesn't quiet easy, that's very irritable all the time. But if you pair that, right, if the universe pairs that infant with a responsive, appropriately responsive and engaged parent, that kid could be secure. Now, if we take that same temperament and we pair that infant with a parent who maybe has major depressive disorder or a substance abuse issue or might just be narcissistic, then what we run into is very negative outcomes. Okay, very negative outcomes because that infant isn't being responded to in kind. Okay, very unique, and for me, as this being my area, a fantastical relationship. As a developmental psychologist, we talk about nature versus nurture. We also talk about staged versus continuous development. Now, stage development is the chrysalis, right? It's the monarch butterfly. It's the first we have this, then we have this, and then this leads to that, right? Stage development. Erickson, Kohlberg, Piaget, Freud, all of them are stage theorists. We also like to talk about, though, continuous, like the big, tall redwoods, that over time, just as with the natural passage of time and the allocation of resources, an individual would develop on this trajectory anyway. Most often, we talk about physical development as being very continuous, right? Every day, you're burning calories, you're building muscles, you're getting taller, you're creating neural connections, you have myelin happening in your brain. Okay, that's very continuous. We could also break that up into stages like infant development, child development, and we really like to do that as developmental psychologists because it puts things in a cute little box. It allows it to be compartmentalized for us. Doesn't serve us as much as it could in longevity, right, over a longer period of time. But there really is some value and some insight in that. All right, now I'm kind of, that was just sort of a debrief on bigger topics in development or just some of the bigger questions that we typically ask. Now I want to take you into one of the earliest, biggest developmental environmental factors that we have. So this would be on the nurture side, right? Teratogens. These are chemicals, environmental exposure that can cause harm to fetuses. Now, I do spend time talking about this in Psych 101 because what we see in human development is that exposure to these teratogens during different periods of fetal development can actually have lifelong developmental outcomes. So if I'm going to talk about the impact in your life, this is as early as I can go. Outside of whether or not your parents smoked pot or used drugs. Women only have one set of eggs their entire life, right? They're born with them. They're carried inside of their mother. So technically, I've carried my grandchildren if my daughters have anything biologically. Men get new sperm all the time, but chronic pot smoking, alcohol, other substance abuse, and even chemical exposures at places of employment can all impact the DNA of sperm. Unfortunately for women, right, we don't have this re-up cycle every 3-ish days. We have one set our whole life. So any chemicals that we get exposed to voluntarily or involuntarily, we could harm those cells, those embryonic cells, pardon me, not embryonics, those, the ovaries, the ovum. We can harm them and then subsequently have some of these effects. So let's say two fully healthy, completely fine, a sperm and an ovum come together, an egg come together. And then they're in utero. And in utero, we get exposed to a chemical. In the chat, if you guys would please go ahead and type what are some teratogens in our culture. Radiation, alcohol, yes. Heroin, vaping, alcohol, cigarettes, weed, drugs, nicotine, smoking, meth, cocaine, yes, yes, yes. Narcotics, pollution, crack, alcohol. How many of you has anybody here ever heard of what pregnant women shouldn't eat or do? What are some things that we say in our drink? Yeah, eat sushi, have coffee, cinnamon. Oh, I've never heard of that one. Mercury, yes. Cat litter, yes. Raw fish, red meat, like literally everything. So the reason why women in America are counseled to stay away from sushi, the Japanese women don't stop eating sushi. We just have such low quality seafood and we have such high mercury content. That's the reason why we don't. That's why we don't. Why we recommend not eating sushi. If you can get really high quality, no or low mercury seafood, then you can do that. Blue cheese, because of the fermentation process that cheese goes through, it has been told to be damaging to that. The other thing is that what we run into are things like don't dye your hair. One of the first things that your obstetrician is going to do when you tell them that you're pregnant is that they're going to want to know where you work and if you're around any chemicals. And that's all really important information because all of that helps us understand the exposure of the fetus to possible teratogens. Now, I'm going to show you this graph, and don't let it freak you out. I just love this shit. So the numbers across the top, the 1, the 2, the 3, the 4, that's just weeks. So like you look like a fetus in 2 months. You know, I mean, you still have a tail. But for the most part, you look like a fetus. I mean, you go through a period of time where you look like a little lizard, and then a big lizard, and then an alien, and then you look like a baby. If you look in that first 2 columns, the week 1 and week 2, you'll see cellular division. That blastocyst is one of the things, one of the reasons why a lot of women will think that they are not pregnant, because they'll have a period. And that's when the blastocyst is attaching to the uterine lining. And when it does that, it sloughs off some of those blood cells so it can look like a really light period for some people. And that's why some women are like, I didn't know I was pregnant 2 months into it. But the blastocysts develop, the cells multiply. And if you look at the top part of week 2, you can see this is where the cellular division really happens. We have a placenta, we have a sac, and then we begin to develop the neural unit. I just find it just wicked fascinating. What I want to draw your attention to, most importantly, are the bars located underneath the different stages of fetal development. And these bars, the purple ones, these are highly sensitive periods. We talk about critical periods in development all the time. And these critical periods are periods of time where certain, again, in this example, chemical exposures or opportunities, if kids are not exposed to tactile things and oral things and visual things. These critical periods are periods of development where things need to be happening, okay? So in these critical periods, if you look across the very top line, you'll see neural tube deficits, mental retardation, and then you'll see CNS. That CNS at the end in the green is central nervous system. And it's pretty much the most vulnerable thing for the longest period of time. It is very vulnerable for a very long period of time. If you kind of look at it though, it looks like a lot of vulnerabilities go away between the 8th and the 9th week, or the 8th and the 10th week of fetal development. Students always ask me, well, my friend, got drunk on her wedding night and she was pregnant and she didn't know it and the baby turned out just fine. Yes, they do that, right? Some fetuses are more resilient than others, and this takes us to the nature, right? It takes us to that DNA. Some fetuses are more resilient than others, which means that they can have some chemical exposures. You can never assume what your fetus is. Heart, upper limbs, lower limbs, upper lip, ears, eyes, teeth, palate, and external genitalia. typically masculinization of female genitalia. Up until the 8th week, a male and a female fetus looks the exact same. That's one of the hypotheses now that suggests that why men have nipples, you know, because fetally we're all the same. Like, and fetally we really are the same. And it isn't until the 8th week of fetal development when a gene, the SRY gene we call that, says be a boy. And then the message gets sent, and then what was going to be a cervix and what was going to be ovaries turns into the head of a penis. Pardon me, the clitoris turns into the head of the penis, the same amount of nerve endings in the head of a male penis as in the female clitoris. And surprisingly, a lot of people think the clitoris is a very small entity, and it's actually a massive bundle of nerves that has about the same number of nerve endings as the head of a penis. Testicles, ovaries, all of those resources, all of that genetic material, all those proteins, all those acids are already there. And once that gene says be a boy, then that's when things start to change. The masculinization of female genitalia, you can see that that's happening around the 7th and 8th. That's when some of that is confusing, and the teratogens activate something, but obviously don't activate something completely. I highly recommend taking a class on identity, sexual identity. The reason being is that, and one of the reasons why so many people in our culture are moving away from, you know, two sexes, a bimodal sex, is because we can have people who have secondary sex characteristics or primary sex characteristics like genitalia and breasts and things like that that represent one gender, while hormonally, testosterone, estrogen, neurologically, they could actually be of a different gender. And so we're learning a lot in fetal science. I would say probably one of the most groundbreaking things in fetal science is around the, I want to say, 5th month of in utero. They're starting to see some science that says that certain levels of testosterone exposures or lack thereof for male fetuses can result in more effeminate males. Not gay, but just more effeminate males. So I think that when we look at the science of development, I think this is where we're headed, looking at the impact of this very powerful fetal development. All right.
We had a couple questions. I don't know
Happy
if you
to take
wanted.
them. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. There are a couple people, or there was a little discussion going on about intersex individuals and that development. There were just a couple people who I think hadn't heard of that or were curious about that. I don't know if that's something you know a ton about.
Well, I mean, that's what I was just talking about, was the differences in hormones and the differences in genitalia, and how sometimes genetically an individual could have both sex organs, both typically a smaller than average penis, and normally that would be elongated clitoris, and still have a vaginal canal, and might even have an external testes. I mean, there are so many variations on the theme. Some of those things happen through genetics. Some of those things happen through teratogens. You know, if we're going to stick with the philosophy or the philosophy of evolutionary psychology, right? I mean, there would be a rationale for why that would be happening genetically. There are so many variations, you guys. It's so hard for us to say option A, option B now. We just know too much in the science. Yeah, it's really changed. Did you have another question, Hannah?
I don't think we had any others, just a little discussion.
Okay. Yeah. No, that's great. That's a wonderful, wonderful question. Yeah, we're gonna get to the Family Guy here in just a second. This is me trying to like keep it short in the developmental content. I really sucked at it. I'm talking a lot more than I normally do. I normally give you guys a few more opportunities to break out and talk, but I guess maybe I just want to be heard today. We're going to talk about biological development, everything from what you guys just saw in the fetal development all the way up into death and deterioration. We typically focus our resources biologically on infancy, childhood, and adolescence. Adulthood aging has actually something that when I was going through my master's program in the 1999, my God, 1999, 2000, when I was in my master's program, I was taking classes in aging because I was studying to be a developmental psychologist, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to focus on gerontological research. Well, what I was told then, and it has been borne out now, right? This was 10 plus years ago, that gerontological science is one of the fastest, most profitable growing areas that we have out there. And the reason being is the boomers. Why? Because they're there, right? We have such a large population of individuals, the largest one we've ever had, obviously. And we have these individuals who are really working hard in life, and they want to reap the benefits. They want to understand how to live longer. What does that quality of life look like? And all of that has spurred on quite a bit of gerontological research that we've done. The biological is pretty simple. And this is part of that continuous theories in developmental psychology that I was talking about, where with the passage of time and the offering of nutrients, much like a plant, this is what would happen. Your cells would grow, divide, grow, and then eventually you reach a point where they begin to slow down in growth and then actually begin to deteriorate. And that's where we have death. That is where we have death. Simple as that. I divided this into the three main areas of development: biological, cognitive, and social emotional. I say social emotional for last because that's my favorite. Cognitive development, we have Piaget, okay? Piaget, French researcher. We still talk about his stuff today, even though empirically it's not really validated, but because he, put it into a cute little theory, we use it to organize our thoughts pretty frequently. So in organizing our thoughts about cognitive development throughout the lifespan, Piaget provided us with an early framework, right? An early way to get that started. Now, we have lots of criticisms of Piaget. Our first criticism is that Piaget based his entire theory on observations that he made of his own kids. Do you guys think I have an objective view of my daughters? No, they're miraculous, they're brilliant, they're fabulous, right? There's nobody better than her. Look at how smart she is. Look at what she did, and that's not reality, folks. That is not reality. So the first thing that Piaget gets is that he's really focused on looking at this, and he's not as objective as he was as a person, right? You're not going to see your kids the same way that you would see somebody else. So that was one of our first criticisms of Piaget. Our other criticism of Piaget was that he said that once you got done with something, you were done, okay? And anybody who has tried to learn a language after the age of 5 years of age, right? A lot of us struggle, but we pick it up fairly quickly, okay? But Piaget said that you can't go back, and explore new things and develop new understandings of stuff. That's our other big criticism of Piaget. Now, Piaget had several stages of development. Remember, biology is continuous, but our cognitive development is going to be cognitive, moral, and social emotional, and personality development are all stage related. Sensory motor is that infancy. It's all about learning how my body moves, learning how I can control those extremities. Gross motor, fine motor, sensory motor. And it's sensory because, if any of you have ever seen a tiny, they get something in their hand and it goes straight to their mouth, right? Not only is that an evolutionary resource, right, to be able to feed myself, but that's how as infants, they try to understand the world. They put it in their mouth. They get the shape of it, they get the taste of it, they get the understanding of it in there. I did sign language, not baby sign. Baby sign is the baby makes up the word and you use it. I used American Sign Language with my daughter when she was an infant. And the first sentence I ever used with her was, please take that rock out of your mouth. It worked. She got it, you know, she totally got it. And, but that's that sensory motor, right? Understanding how I can be an active agent in this space. And normally that's about birth to a year and a half, okay, maybe 2 years, birth to a year and a half, 2 years. And then we roll into pre-operational. Pre-operational, I'm starting to understand how things work. I might be outside of just trying to experience my environment through what I can taste, touch, smell, and feel. And that development is really important. And that development is typically marked by what we call object permanence. And Piaget set up his theory that said, okay, once you finished sensory motor, then this happened. Once you finished sensory pre-operational stage, then this happened. Okay, and actually, object permanence is the bridge between sensory motor and pre-operational development. And I'm going to show you guys this cute little video.
Well, this is a bigger surprise than that time Peter vanished into thin air.
Hey, Stewie, peekaboo.
Yes, I see you, fat man.
Where's Daddy?
What? Where did you go? Oh, this is impossible. I can hear you, but I can't see. Really must really be gone.
Peekaboo.
Ah! How the hell did you do that? Look, I thought you disappeared. Otherwise, I wouldn't have picked mine. Oh, great. Leave when I'm right in the middle of a sentence.
So what Stewie's showing us there is this idea of object permanence, where if for that infant sensorily, right, if I can no longer see it, then it doesn't exist. That's one of the reasons why infants struggle so much when their parents leave, is that my parent is no longer in this physical space. My parent has abandoned me. They don't have the cognitive complexity to think about abandonment, but they no longer find things familiar. And that's that first touch. And so we know that we're bridging from sensory motor into this pre-operational stage once the peekaboo doesn't work anymore, okay? Just one of your favorite games to play them, because they think that when they can't see your eyes, you're gone. You've totally disappeared. And Stewie does a great job of modeling that for us. Now, the bridge from pre-operational to concrete operational is what we call conservation tasks. Now, conservation tasks are cognitive hurdles that allow, that are surmounted when kids can cross metrics, right? Cross the metrics of volume and height. So one of our most frequently used concrete operational tasks is you fill up 2 flasks of water, and they're the exact same shape, right? They're 2 tall beakers of water. And then you have a third beaker that's really wide and short. And then you pour one of those 2 tall beakers into the shorter beaker. And the fluid spreads out, right? So it's not as vertically high, still the same volume, right? Still the same amount of liquid. But the line, right, relative to the table has actually changed. And so when you ask kids which one of these 2 has more, they're going to say the one that has the taller line, even though no water has spilled out. Okay. Another thing that they would do is they would line up 2 rows of quarters, 5 quarters each. And they would first test the kid to say, are these lines equal, these rows of quarters? And they'll be like, oh yeah, they're equal. And then all they do is they spread out one of those rows of quarters. And then they say to the kid, are they equal now? And they said, no, this one, there's more in this one. And that is an amount versus length conversion. And so this concrete operations, they are operating concretely, like in one way, okay? What we're working on, the big cognitive task here, is to be flexible, to be able to say, it's still the same amount of quarters. This one is now taking up more surface area. It's still the same amount of water. This one's just, you know, longer and taller because it's in this vessel versus this other one. The last one that Piaget talks about is formal operations, which generally starts around 11 years of age, or according to Piaget. Science today says that formal operations might actually start quite a bit earlier than 11 years of age. But he really views formal operations as being like the last cognitive hurdle. Like, that's it. Now you just get better at what you do and you are in cognitive maturity. Well, that doesn't work. Right? That doesn't work. A lot of people, in fact, if I were to give this assessment to every single student in my class today, Research suggests that 70% of you would not test out at formal operations given Piaget's definition. And that's a lot. So we're still working on understanding those cognitive aspects, right? Understanding Piaget and the impacts there. One of the things that I've been really excited about lately, and I've dived into quite a bit, is this idea of meaning making. And that at this stage in your life specifically, one of your cognitive tasks that's keeping you growing is working on meaning making, taking in the world and deciding how the world impacts you and whether or not you want to actually evolve from that. That's an assimilation and accommodation, which is also part of Piaget. But the cognitive task that you all are working on now is meaning making. Right? Every time you hear a political ideology, every time you hear a fact of science, every time you hear somebody retell a story of relationships, you are trying that on. You are saying, is this something that's a part of me? Is this something that contributes to me? Is this something that I want to incorporate? Now, you're not really doing that consciously. You might be if you're studying something. But for the most part, you're not really doing that consciously. That's all happening behind the scenes. All right, the last one is social emotional development. Erickson. Now, what I would love for you to do is, if you need to, you can go ahead and open up your textbook. This is just from our textbook. It's table 9.1. I'm going to send you guys out into discussion groups, and what I want you to do is I want you to talk about and figure out which stage of development you're in as far as Erickson goes. Please do not confine yourself, right, or limit yourself to this discussion only based upon age. I'll tell you, this is one of our criticisms of Erickson. He said that everything was a crisis and that once you resolve the crisis, you were done. You could move on. Well, we revisit these things all the time. Trust versus mistrust, that most aligns with attachment, but that happens in adult relationships too, okay? So do yourself a favor, right? Kind of try to ignore those ages and just look at the descriptors of these different stages of social emotional development.